In the cold, impersonal world of air travel, where we are all just a ticket number and a destination, a single act of cruelty can ripple outwards with devastating force. For 17-year-old David Henderson, a boy whose spirit soared higher than any aircraft, a gate agent's heartless laugh was meant to shatter his dignity. But what she didn't know was that David saw things others missed, and that on this day his observation would do more than just silence her laughter. It would ground an entire fleet, expose a deadly secret, and unleash a storm of karma so swift and so precise it would change all of their lives forever. Denver International Airport was a symphony of orchestrated chaos, a place where time was both a commodity and an enemy. The great tented roof of the Yepesen terminal, meant to evoke the snow-capped Rocky Mountains, felt less like a majestic peak and more like a pressure cooker lid on this sweltering August afternoon. Underneath it, thousands of human stories converged and diverged, reunions, farewells, anxious business trips, and long-awaited vacations. For Chloe Henderson and her son David, this was the final leg of a journey, a connecting flight from Denver to San Francisco that would take them home. Chloe watched her son, a familiar mix of pride and fierce protectiveness tightening her chest. At 17, David possessed a quiet intensity that often made people uncomfortable. He was tall and lanky, with deep, intelligent eyes that seemed to absorb every detail of the world around him. His passion was aerodynamics, a love affair with physics and flight that had started with paper airplanes and now involved complex simulation software on his laptop. He didn't just want to fly. He wanted to understand the soul of the machine that defied gravity. This passion was his escape, his fortress against a world that too often saw only the uncooperative nature of his body. David had a form of cerebral palsy that primarily affected his legs. His gait was uneven, a laborious rolling motion that required immense concentration and physical effort. Each step was a negotiation between his brain's command and his muscles' reluctant response. He could walk, and he insisted on it, viewing the canes and wheelchairs that others offered as symbols of surrender. His independence was a non-negotiable principle, a quiet rebellion he waged every single day. Their gate B442 was an island of simmering frustration. The flight was delayed by 30 minutes, then 60, and now the departures board simply blinked delayed, with no time attached, a digital shrug that frayed the nerves of everyone waiting. The air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and the low grumble of discontent. Presiding over this small kingdom of anxiety was a gate agent named Brenda Jenkins. She was a woman in her late 40s, her airline uniform stretched taut over a frame that spoke of years spent sitting in a single chair. Her face was a mask of professional indifference, but her eyes, sharp and quick, missed nothing. She moved with an economy of motion that bordered on aggressive. Her gestures sharp, her voice a clipped monotone that sliced through the ambient noise. She had fielded the same questions 100 times, and her patience had long since been ground down to a fine, bitter powder. Chloe watched Brenda handle a family with 2 screaming toddlers. The mother was flustered, the father apologetic. Brenda didn't offer a shred of sympathy. She tapped a perfectly manicured nail on the counter. "Passports, boarding passes. I need all of them out and ready." Her voice was flat impatient. She scanned them, slapped them back on the counter, and gestured them through without a word, her gaze already moving to the next person in line. "She seems stressed," Chloe whispered to David, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder. David didn't look up from the window where he was watching a Boeing 707 taxi toward the runway. "She seems mean," he corrected her, his voice low. He didn't need to see overt cruelty to recognize the absence of kindness. He had a PhD in reading micro-expressions, in sensing the subtle shifts in atmosphere that occurred when people saw him walk. He recognized the look in Brenda's eyes, not just stress, but a deep, weary resentment of the people she was paid to serve. Finally, a crackle from the PA system. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We will now begin boarding Flight 3471 to San Francisco. We would like to invite our Global Services members, families traveling with small children, and any passengers requiring special assistance to begin pre-boarding at this time." Chloe squeezed David's shoulder. "That's us, honey." David nodded, closing his laptop and carefully sliding it into his backpack. He pushed himself up from the chair, his legs stiff from the long wait. The first few steps were always the hardest, his body a cold engine reluctantly turning over. He took a deep breath, found his rhythm, and began the slow, deliberate journey toward the gate. Chloe walked beside him, not touching, but close enough to be a silent, unwavering wall of support. The line for pre-boarding was short. The family with the toddlers, an elderly man with a cane, and now them. As they approached the counter, Brenda Jenkins's eyes flicked down to David's legs, then back up to his face. It was a fleeting glance, but it was laden with a tired clinical judgment that David knew all too well. It was the look that said, "You are going to be a problem. You are going to make my difficult day even more difficult." "Good afternoon," Chloe said, her voice warm as she handed over their boarding passes. Brenda took them without a word. Her eyes were fixed on her monitor as she scanned the barcodes. Beep, beep. She slid them back across the counter, her gaze still glued to the screen. "You can go ahead." "Thank you," Chloe said. David moved past the counter, his focus entirely on the jet bridge that stretched out before him like a tunnel. He could feel Brenda's eyes on his back. It was a heavy, palpable sensation, like the air pressing in before a thunderstorm. He hated pre-boarding. It felt like being put on display, the special case who got to go first. But he knew the alternative was worse, trying to navigate a crowded aisle with impatient passengers sighing behind him. This was the lesser of two evils. He took his first step onto the jet bridge, his hand gripping the railing. The slight downward slope was a challenge, forcing him to brace with each step to control his momentum. He could hear his own labored breathing, the scuff of his sneakers on the grooved floor. It was in these moments, in the enclosed silence of the jet bridge, that his disability felt most pronounced. There was no crowd to hide in, no distraction. There was only the challenge of the next step and the next. He was about halfway down his mother, a few feet behind him, when he heard it. It wasn't loud, but in the sterile quiet of the corridor, it was as clear as a gunshot. It was a laugh, a short, sharp, dismissive snort, followed by a low, muttered comment to a co-worker who had just walked up. David couldn't make out the exact words, but he didn't need to. He knew the sound. It was the sound of mockery. The sound of someone finding amusement in his struggle. He stopped his hand tightening on the railing until his knuckles turned white. The world seemed to narrow to that single, piercing sound. He turned his head slowly, his eyes finding Brenda Jenkins back at the podium. She was looking right at him, a smirk playing on her lips as she leaned toward her colleague. The colleague glanced over her eyes wide with a flicker of embarrassment before she quickly looked away. But Brenda's smirk remained. It was a look of pure, unadulterated contempt. Time seemed to warp in the narrow confines of the jet bridge. For David, The moment stretched into an eternity. Brenda's smirk was a physical blow, a calculated act of cruelty that landed with pinpoint precision. It wasn't just a laugh. It was a verdict. It confirmed his deepest fear that the world saw his effort not as a display of strength, but as a pathetic, comical failure. He had spent his entire life building armor against pity, but he had no defense against contempt. Chloe saw the change in him instantly. The determined set of his jaw slackened, the focus in his eyes clouded over with a familiar deep hurt. She saw him falter, his rhythm broken. Her own heart clenched with a surge of maternal fury, so potent it felt like a physical fire in her veins. She turned her gaze locking with Brenda's. The gate agent's smirk vanished, replaced by a mask of bland professionalism, but the guilt was a faint shadow in her eyes. She knew she'd been caught. "Is something funny?" Chloe's voice was low, dangerously calm. It was the voice she used when a doctor had been dismissive or a teacher had been impatient. It was her battle voice. Brenda blinked, feigning ignorance. "Ma'am, you need to continue down the jet bridge. You're holding up the boarding process." "I asked you a question," Chloe pressed, taking a step back toward the podium. "My son is working hard to get on this plane, and you stood there and laughed at him. I want to know what you found so amusing." A flicker of annoyance crossed Brenda's face. This was a deviation from the script. Passengers were supposed to be cattle-compliant, predictable. A confrontation was an inconvenience. "I'm not sure what you're talking about," she said, her voice taking on a defensive edge. "I was having a private conversation with my colleague. A conversation that involved laughing and pointing in my son's direction." Chloe retorted, her voice rising slightly. "Don't you dare lie to me." Other passengers in the boarding area were starting to notice. Phones, which had been tools for staving off boredom, were now subtly being angled in their direction. Among them was Rebecca Albright, a corporate consultant who specialized in crisis management. She was a woman who lived by observation and analysis. She had seen the whole thing, David's determined struggle, Brenda's whispered comment, the ugly smirk, and the colleague's hasty retreat. Her mind, trained to identify liability and PR disasters, immediately categorized the incident. Unprofessional conduct, ADA violation potential, significant brand risk. But it was more than that for Rebecca. She had a nephew with muscular dystrophy, and she had witnessed firsthand the daily battles he fought and the casual cruelty of strangers. The scene resonated on a deeply personal level. She didn't hesitate. Her thumb swiped across her phone's screen, opening the camera app. She held it low, pretending to be texting, but the lens was aimed directly at the unfolding drama. David, meanwhile, felt trapped between his mother's righteous anger and his own mortification. He just wanted to disappear. He wanted to be on the plane in his seat with his headphones on, blocking out the world. "Mom, just leave it," he said, his voice strained. "Let's just go." His words, meant to de-escalate, only fueled Chloe's fire. Her son should not have to retreat. He should not have to be the one to feel shame. "No, David, we are not just leaving it. This woman owes you an apology." Brenda crossed her arms, a classic defensive posture. "Ma'am, for the last time, I was not laughing at your son. You're creating a scene. Now either get on the plane, or I'll have to call security." The threat hung in the air, thick and ugly. Calling security on a disabled teenager and his mother. The absurdity of it was breathtaking. Rebecca Albright zoomed in slightly with her phone's camera. She captured the rigid set of Brenda's jaw, the furious disbelief on Chloe's face, and the profound weariness in David's eyes. This was more than just a rude employee. This was a systemic failure of human decency, and it was happening under the banner of a multi-billion-dollar airline. "You wouldn't dare," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling with rage. "Try me." Brenda shot back her hand, moving toward the phone on the podium. It was David who broke the stalemate. He couldn't stand it anymore. The humiliation was a physical weight pressing down on him, making it hard to breathe. With a surge of adrenaline, he turned and forced himself down the rest of the jet bridge. Each step was a thunderclap in his ears. He didn't look back. He just needed to escape the burning glare of all those eyes. He stumbled into the aircraft cabin, the bright lights and cool recycled air, a stark contrast to the emotionally charged atmosphere of the jet bridge. A flight attendant with a practiced, welcoming smile greeted him. "Welcome aboard." David could only manage a tight nod, avoiding her eyes. He made his way down the aisle, his backpack feeling like it was filled with rocks. He found their seats, 14A and 14B, and collapsed into the window seat, the rough fabric of the chair, a small comfort. He pressed his forehead against the cool plexiglass, staring out at the controlled chaos of the tarmac below. He could see the ground crew moving with purpose, refueling trucks and baggage carts dancing an intricate ballet around the massive aircraft. A moment later, Chloe appeared. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. She slid into the seat beside him, without a word, her purse hitting the floor with a heavy thud. The fury was still radiating from her in waves. "I'm sorry, Mom," David murmured, still looking out the window. Chloe turned to him, her expression softening instantly. "Oh, honey, no. Don't you ever apologize. You did nothing wrong. That woman is a monster. It's just, I'm used to it," he said, and the simple, honest statement was more heartbreaking to Chloe than any outcry would have been. "You shouldn't have to be," she said, her voice thick with emotion. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers wrapping around his. "I will not let this go. I promise you." David squeezed her hand, but said nothing. He wanted to believe her, but he knew how the world worked. People like Brenda Jenkins were rarely held accountable. They were protected by corporate policies and public apathy. The incident would be a fleeting moment of unpleasantness, a bitter memory for him and his mother, and nothing more. He was wrong. Back at the gate, Rebecca Albright had stopped recording. She had 10 minutes of crystal-clear video. She watched as Brenda, her composure restored, began the general boarding process with renewed, almost vindictive efficiency. Rebecca had a choice. She could file a complaint through the airline's official channels, where it would likely be buried in paperwork. Or she could do what she did for her clients, bypass the system, and take the story directly to the court of public opinion. She found a quiet corner, her fingers flying across the screen of her phone. She crafted a short, powerful post. At Denver International Gate B42, witnessed gate agent Brenda Jenkins of Atlantic Airlines openly mock and laugh at a disabled teen struggling to board. His mother confronted her, and the agent threatened to call security. The cruelty was staggering. "This is not okay." She attached the first minute of the video, the most damning part showing the laugh and the initial confrontation. She tagged the airline major news outlets and several prominent disability rights advocates. Then, with a deep breath, she hit post. The digital signal shot into the ether, a tiny stone tossed into the vast ocean of the internet. But some stones thrown with the right force and at the right time can create a tidal wave. Once settled, David tried to force the incident from his mind. He found his usual solace in the view from the window. The world of the tarmac was a universe of its own, governed by rules and procedures he had spent years studying. He watched the baggage handlers, their movements, economical and precise. He observed the wing flaps and ailerons, noting their positions. He identified the aircraft as a Boeing 737-800, a workhorse of domestic aviation. He knew its engine specifications, its cruising speed, its maximum takeoff weight. This was his sanctuary, a world of logic and engineering that was clean and predictable, unlike the messy, cruel world of human interaction he'd just endured. The cabin door was still open, and the sounds from outside bled into the quiet hum of the auxiliary power unit. It was through this opening that a snippet of conversation drifted up to him, sharp and clear, in a momentary lull. Two members of the ground crew were standing almost directly beneath his window, their bright yellow vests stark against the grey concrete. One was older, with a weathered face and a grease-stained cap. The other was younger, looking anxious. "You sure it's cleared?" the younger one asked, his voice tight with concern. He was gesturing toward the right wing of the plane. "Maintenance signed off on it," the older man grumbled, not sounding entirely convinced himself. "They said the sensor for the number 2 hydraulic system was just glitchy. Cycled it a few times and it came back online. Log says it's good to go." "A glitchy hydraulic sensor," the young man pressed. "That's what controls half the flight surfaces. If that pressure reading is off, if there's a slow leak, they're not seeing. Look, kid." The older man cut him off, his voice low and firm. "Our job is to get this bird pushed back on time. We're already 90 minutes behind schedule. Corporate is breathing down everyone's neck. The pilots have the log maintenance has signed off. It's their call, not ours. Now let's get the chocks pulled." The conversation ended as they moved away. But the words hung in the air for David, chilling him to the bone. Hydraulic system, glitchy sensor, slow leak. He knew exactly what that meant. The 737 has 3 independent hydraulic systems, which provide the immense pressure needed to move the control surfaces, the rudders, the elevators, the ailerons. They are the muscles of the aircraft. While the plane could theoretically be flown with one system out, a failure in a primary system, especially if it was due to an undetected leak, was a potentially catastrophic scenario. A glitchy sensor wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was a warning light on the verge of a system-wide failure. He felt a cold dread creep up his spine that had nothing to do with Brenda Jenkins. This was a different kind of fear, a primal, analytical fear. The men's words, coupled with the long, unexplained delay, painted a disturbing picture. An airline pushing its scheduled maintenance crews, clearing a borderline issue, a potential disaster waiting to happen at 35,000 feet. He turned to his mother, his eyes wide. "Mom," he said, his voice urgent. "I heard something. Outside. The ground crew." Chloe was still stewing in her anger, composing a blistering email to the airline in her head. "What is it, sweetie?" He recounted the conversation, his words tumbling out, precise and technical. He explained the function of the hydraulic system, the critical role of the sensors, the implications of a potential leak. He wasn't just a scared passenger. He was an informed analyst presenting a case. "They signed off on it, but they didn't sound sure." He finished, his voice trembling slightly. "The older guy just said they were behind schedule." Chloe listened, her own anger momentarily forgotten, replaced by a growing sense of alarm. She trusted David's knowledge implicitly. He wasn't prone to exaggeration, especially about aviation. If he was scared, there was a very real reason to be. "Are you sure, David?" "You heard them clearly." "Positive," he insisted. "They were right under the window." Meanwhile, at gate B42, Rebecca Albright's post was exploding. The first few retweets came from fellow passengers who had witnessed the event. Then a disability rights advocate with 50,000 followers shared it. From there, it was picked up by a local journalist who was stuck at the airport on another flight. The video was clear, the audio damning. Brenda's sneering laugh was undeniable. Chloe's pained, furious confrontation was compelling. The hashtag Atlantic Airlines fail started trending in the Denver area. Brenda Jenkins was oblivious to the digital firestorm igniting around her. For her, the confrontation was over. She had won. The disruptive mother and her problematic son were on the plane out of her hair. She was now in her element, efficiently scanning boarding passes, her voice a robotic drone. "Have a great flight. Welcome aboard. Please have your pass ready." Each passenger was a task to be completed, a box to be checked. She was an automaton of procedural compliance, the human element stripped away by years of repetition and resentment. She did notice a few passengers giving her strange looks as they boarded. Some glared with open hostility. Others just shook their heads with a look of disappointment. She chalked it up to the delay. People were always irritable when flights were late. She didn't for a second consider that her own actions, just minutes before, were being broadcast and judged by thousands of people. On the plane, Chloe made a decision. She unbuckled her seatbelt. "I'm going to talk to a flight attendant," she said, her voice firm. "They're not going to listen to me," David said, a note of defeat in his voice. "I'm just a kid. They'll think I'm making it up. They'll listen to me." Chloe replied, her protective instincts now fully re-engaged, but aimed at a new, more immediate threat. She stood up and flagged down a flight attendant who was helping a passenger with an overhead bin. The flight attendant, a woman named Maria, with a warm but weary smile, came over. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" "I hope so." Chloe began, keeping her voice low and steady. "My son, he's an aviation enthusiast. He overheard a conversation between two ground crew members that has us very concerned. It was about a potential issue with the number 2 hydraulic system." Maria's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. They were trained to handle anxious flyers, to offer calm reassurances. "Ma'am, I can assure you that our aircraft undergo rigorous safety checks before every flight. Our maintenance crews are the best in the business." "I'm sure they are," Chloe said, not backing down. "But they mentioned a glitchy sensor and the pressure to stay on schedule. My son," she gestured to David, "knows what that implies. We would feel much better if you could just confirm with the pilots that they are aware of the ground crew's specific concerns, not just what's in the log." Maria looked from Chloe's insistent face to David's worried one. Something in the boy's eyes gave her pause. It wasn't the typical fear of flying she was used to seeing. It was something more specific, more intelligent. It was the look of someone who understood the stakes. Her training told her to dismiss it, to soothe the passenger, and move on. Her gut told her something different. "Okay," she said, her professional mask softening slightly. "Let me go have a quiet word with the captain. I'll be right back." As Maria walked toward the cockpit, a notification pinged on the phone of the airline's regional social media manager, a 20-something named Kevin, working from a cubicle in a distant corporate office. A high engagement alert. A video. A gate agent. He clicked the link, and as he watched the scene unfold at gate B42, he felt a familiar sinking feeling in his stomach. This was not a minor complaint. This was a 5-alarm public relations fire. He picked up his phone and dialed his director. The first domino in the corporate chain of command had just fallen. The cockpit door of the Boeing 737 was a sanctuary, of calm professionalism. Captain Robert Miller, a veteran pilot with over 20,000 flight hours, was going through his final pre-flight checklist with his first officer, a sharp young man named Ben Carter. Miller was a pilot of the old school, meticulous, cautious, and with a deep-seated respect for the powerful machines he flew. He trusted his instruments, his training, and his gut, and he taught his first officers to do the same. The maintenance log did indeed show an issue with the number 2 hydraulic system's pressure sensor. It had been flagged during the initial power-up. The maintenance crew had, as the log stated, cycled the system, and the sensor had returned to its normal operational parameters. The official sign-off was there in black and white. It was a documented, resolved issue. Still, it left a small, nagging splinter of doubt in Miller's mind. Glitchy sensors were often precursors to a larger component failure. There was a soft knock on the cockpit door. Maria, the flight attendant, leaned in, her expression serious. "Captain, sorry to bother you. I have a passenger in 14B. She says her son overheard ground crew discussing their concerns about the hydraulic system. Specifically, they mentioned being rushed and that maintenance just cycled it." Ben Carter sighed, shaking his head. Anxious flyer overhears a conversation out of context. Happens all the time. But Captain Miller didn't dismiss it so quickly. He looked at Maria. "What's your read on them?" "The mother is firm, but it's the son, sir," Maria said. "He's a teenager. He's not panicked. He's scared in a very specific way. He seems to know exactly what he's talking about." Miller mulled this over. The passenger's story corroborated the nagging doubt in his own mind. The maintenance log provided the what the sensor was cleared. The overheard conversation provided the why it was cleared under pressure. An anonymous passenger had just given him a crucial piece of context that the official paperwork lacked. His personal rule, honed over 3 decades of flying, was simple. Never ignore a coincidence that reinforces your own doubt. "All right," Miller said, his voice decisive. He keyed his radio. "Tower, this is Atlantic 3471 at gate B42. We're going to hold our position. I'm requesting maintenance return to the aircraft for a secondary in-depth diagnostic on the number 2 hydraulic system." In the control tower, the request was unusual, but not unheard of. A pilot's discretion was paramount. The controller acknowledged the request and relayed the message. On the tarmac, the lead mechanic who had signed off on the repair swore under his breath when the call came in. A secondary diagnostic would mean hooking up the pressure rig and running a full 30-minute test cycle. It would add at least another hour to the delay and generate a mountain of new paperwork. Reluctantly, he and his team started wheeling the heavy equipment back toward the aircraft. Simultaneously, the digital crisis was escalating. Kevin, the social media manager, had gotten his director on the phone. "The video has over 100,000 views already," Kevin said, his voice tense. "It's been picked up by 2 national-level bloggers. The comments are, they're brutal. People are calling for a boycott. The name Brenda Jenkins is attached to it." The director, a seasoned PR professional named Cynthia, was already in damage control mode. "Get me the employee file on Jenkins. Find out who the station manager is in Denver. I want her pulled from the gate immediately. Immediately, Kevin. I don't want her speaking to another passenger. Draft a holding statement. We are aware of the incident and are conducting a full investigation. We do not condone this behavior as it does not reflect our values of respect and dignity for all our passengers." Standard stuff. "Get it ready, but don't post it yet. I need to brief the VP." The corporate machinery, slow and lumbering at first, was now kicking into high gear. Emails flew. Phone calls crisscrossed the country. The small, cruel moment at gate B42 was now a line item on a corporate crisis management agenda. Back on Flight 3471, the passengers were growing restless. Captain Miller's voice came over the intercom, his tone carefully neutral. "Folks, this is your captain speaking. Apologies for the continued delay. During our final checks, I wasn't completely satisfied with a sensor reading on one of our systems. Out of an abundance of caution, we're having our maintenance team perform a more comprehensive inspection before we depart. Your safety is our absolute top priority, and we appreciate your patience." The cabin filled with a collective groan. People pulled out their phones to rebook connections to complain to loved ones. For most, it was a frustrating but mundane travel hiccup. For David and Chloe, it was a profound relief. Chloe looked at her son, her eyes filled with a new kind of awe. "You did that, David. You're listening your knowledge. You made that happen." David felt a small, unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest. For once he had been seen not for his disability, but for his ability, his mind. His passion had become a tool, a weapon, a shield. Down below, the maintenance team was working. The younger mechanic from the earlier conversation was the one who hooked up the external pressure rig. As the system pressurized, he watched the gauges. For the first 10 minutes, everything held steady, just as it had before. The lead mechanic stood by arms crossed, tapping his foot impatiently. "See, told you it was a glitch." But the younger mechanic kept watching, and then he saw it, a tiny, almost imperceptible drop in pressure, a single psi. Then another. It was slow, dangerously slow. A drop so gradual it would never be caught during a quick pre-flight cycle, but would become critical over the course of a multi-hour flight as hydraulic fluid seeped out of a hairline fracture in a high-pressure line. "There," the young mechanic said, his voice barely a whisper. "There it is. We've got a bleeder." The lead mechanic's face went pale. A slow hydraulic leak wasn't a glitch. It was a ticking time bomb. If that line had ruptured at altitude, the pilots would have lost control of the aircraft. The consequences were unthinkable. He grabbed his radio, his hand shaking. He didn't call his supervisor. He called the airport's Federal Aviation Administration FAA Oversight Office, the one call a mechanic never wants to make, the one that blows past corporate channels and brings the full weight of federal authority down on an aircraft. An anonymous tip, he would later call it. A duty of conscience. He reported a critical safety failure on Atlantic 3471, a failure that had been improperly cleared by maintenance under schedule pressure. The unraveling was now complete. The personal, the corporate, and the mechanical threads of the story were pulling apart at the same time, each one triggering the next in a chain reaction of cause and effect that had all started with a single heartless laugh. The call from the mechanic to the FAA's airport field office acted like a lit match in a room full of gasoline. The FAA does not deal in nuance or corporate apologies. It deals in absolutes of safety and regulation. The words improperly cleared and critical safety failure triggered an immediate, non-negotiable protocol. An on-site FAA safety inspector, a formidable man named Frank Coleman, who had seen everything in his 40 years in aviation, was dispatched to Gate B-42 with a mandate to ground the aircraft until a full federal inspection could be completed. Frank moved with the unhurried, implacable authority of a man who could shut down a multi-million-dollar operation with a single sentence. He arrived at the gate, his badge prominently displayed, and was met by the airline's station manager, a man whose face was already a mask of sweat and anxiety. The manager had just been on the phone with corporate getting screamed at about the viral video. Now he had a federal inspector on his doorstep. His day had gone from bad to catastrophic. "Frank," the manager said, trying to sound calm. "What's going on?" Captain Miller just wanted a second look. "It's out of Captain Miller's hands now, Ken," Frank replied, his voice a low gravel. "I have a credible report of a critical system failure being knowingly overlooked. Flight 3471 is officially grounded. I want everyone off that plane. Now. And I want the full maintenance logs, all personnel records for the crew who worked on it, and a copy of your departure time performance metrics for the last quarter." He wasn't just investigating a faulty part. He was investigating the culture that allowed a faulty part to be overlooked. The station manager's face crumpled. The last request was the killer. The performance metrics would show the intense, relentless pressure from corporate headquarters to minimize delays at all costs. Pressure that led mechanics to cut corners and pilots to second-guess their instincts. The announcement, when it came, was delivered not by the captain, but by a somber-voiced flight attendant. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention, please? Due to an unforeseen and non-negotiable directive from the FAA, this flight has been cancelled. I repeat, Flight 3471 to San Francisco has been cancelled. We need everyone to please gather their personal belongings and deplane in an orderly fashion. Airline representatives at the gate will provide you with information on rebooking." The cabin, already simmering with frustration, erupted. An audible wave of fury, disbelief, and despair washed over the passengers. Shouts of "Cancelled! You've got to be kidding me! And I have a wedding to get to!" echoed through the aircraft. For David and Chloe, however, the word "cancelled" was the most beautiful sound in the world. It was confirmation, validation. David's fear had been real. The danger had been real. He looked out the window and saw the FAA inspector talking to the ground crew, his authoritative stance leaving no room for argument. David felt a profound sense of relief that was so overwhelming it almost brought him to tears. He hadn't just saved himself, he had saved everyone on the plane. The process of deplaning was slow and agonizing. The passengers, now a disgruntled mob, shuffled off the plane and back up the jet bridge. The very same jet bridge David had struggled down what felt like a lifetime ago. When they reached the gate, the scene was one of pure chaos. A massive crowd had formed around the podium, everyone trying to get rebooked. The station manager was trying to calm people down, but he was hopelessly outnumbered. And in the middle of it all stood Brenda Jenkins. The order for her to be removed from the gate had come too late, lost in the cascading series of emergencies. She was now forced to face the direct consequences of the flight cancellation, a crisis she had no idea was so intimately linked to her own behavior. She was trying to operate the computer, her face a stony mask, but her hands were trembling slightly. The sheer volume of passenger anger was a physical force pressing in on her from all sides. As Chloe and David approached, a man in a business suit, who had been on the plane with them, pointed a finger directly at Brenda. He had seen Rebecca's video on his phone while they were waiting. "You!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the din. "This is your fault!" Brenda looked up, bewildered. "Sir, I don't control the FAA." "No, I'm talking about you!" he yelled now, holding up his phone so others could see the video. "Laughing at a disabled kid. That's the kind of company you work for. Cutting corners on safety. Treating people like dirt. It's all part of the same rotten culture." A murmur went through the crowd as more people saw the video. The abstract anger over a cancelled flight began to coalesce and focus onto a single, deserving target. The glares that had been subtle before were now open and hostile. People weren't just angry at the airline anymore. They were angry at her. Brenda stared at the phone screen, at the tiny moving image of herself, her face twisted in that ugly, sneering smirk. For the first time, she saw her actions from an outside perspective. There was no context of a bad day, no excuse of stress. There was only the raw, undeniable cruelty of the moment. The blood drained from her face. In that instant, she was no longer an anonymous agent of a faceless corporation. She was Brenda Jenkins, the woman who laughed at a disabled teenager. The weight of it, the public shame, hit her with the force of a physical impact. She stumbled back a step, her professional facade finally shattering into a million pieces. She was completely, utterly exposed. The karma wasn't just coming for her. It had arrived, and it was standing right in front of her, holding 100 cell phone cameras. Chloe guided David through the chaos, shielding him from the worst of it. They didn't join the mob at the counter. They just needed a quiet place to sit and process. As they walked away, David glanced back one last time. He saw Brenda surrounded her face a mask of horror and disbelief as the consequences of her small, thoughtless cruelty unfolded around her on an epic scale. He didn't feel triumph or even satisfaction. He just felt a deep, profound sadness for the whole miserable situation. The video, which had been a regional brushfire, was now a national inferno. Rebecca Albright's post had been picked up by major news aggregators and was the top trending story on Twitter and Facebook. The narrative was powerful and simple: a heartless airline employee, a vulnerable teen, and a cancelled flight that now seemed like cosmic justice. News outlets, smelling blood in the water, began to connect the dots. The FAA's grounding of the flight, initially a separate story, was now being woven into the same narrative as the viral video, creating a powerful, albeit speculative, link in the public's mind. Atlantic Airlines was a company so rotten it disrespected its disabled passengers and flew unsafe planes. In the gleaming corporate headquarters of Atlantic Airlines, the atmosphere was one of controlled panic. The emergency PR meeting was in full swing, attended by VPs of communications, legal, and operations. The draft statement Kevin had prepared was deemed laughably inadequate. "Does not reflect our values," the VP of legal, a stern woman named Eleanor Vance, scoffed. "The entire internet is watching a video that shows our values are in fact laughing at children with disabilities. We are so far past that. The FAA situation is the real killer," the VP of operations added, pacing the room. "They've impounded the aircraft. They're auditing our entire Denver maintenance division. The unsafe planes narrative is going to stick to us like glue. This isn't just a PR problem anymore. This is an existential threat to our brand." The decision was swift and brutal. Brenda Jenkins was no longer an employee to be retrained or reprimanded. She was a liability to be excised. The station manager in Denver was ordered to escort her off the premises immediately. Her termination papers would be sent by courier. The airline would then issue a new statement, one that included a deep personal apology to the Henderson family. The immediate termination of the employee involved a full refund and compensation for every passenger on the cancelled flight, and a commitment to a company-wide review of their ADA compliance and sensitivity training. It was a full-scale corporate surrender. Brenda was in a small, windowless office near the gate, trying to catch her breath, when the station manager, Ken, walked in. His face was ashen. He didn't sit down. "Brenda," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth, "you need to come with me. Hand over your badge." Ken, what's going on?" she pleaded, her voice cracking. "It was a stupid joke. I was stressed. The flight was delayed." "It's over, Brenda," he said, holding out his hand for her ID. "Corporate called. You're done. They want you off the property. Now." The finality in his voice was absolute. There was no appeal, no hearing, no union representative to call. She had become toxic, a symbol of everything wrong with the company, and she was being surgically removed. She numbly unclipped the badge that had been a part of her identity for 19 years and placed it in his hand. The plastic felt cold and foreign. As two airport security officers discreetly escorted a stunned Brenda through a back corridor to avoid the public. Her personal phone, which she hadn't looked at in hours, began to buzz incessantly. Friends and family, seeing her face on the news, were calling and texting. She ignored them. She felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if she were watching a movie about someone else's life falling apart. The shame was a physical cloak, heavy and suffocating. She finally made it to her car in the employee parking lot. She sat in the driver's seat, the engine off the silence of the concrete garage pressing in on her. She finally looked at her phone. She saw dozens of missed calls, but the one that made her heart stop was from her son, Adam. Her relationship with Adam was strained, to say the least. He was 21, a college student who rarely called. They hadn't had a real conversation in months, just a series of tense, obligatory texts. He struggled with severe anxiety and had accused her more than once of being dismissive of his invisible disability, of telling him to just toughen up. She had always seen his struggles as a weakness, a frustrating lack of the grit she believed she possessed in spades. With a trembling hand, she called him back. He answered on the first ring. "Adam?" "I saw it, Mum," he said. His voice wasn't angry. It was worse. It was quiet, filled with a weary, devastating disappointment. "My roommate showed it to me. Everyone is sharing it. That's you. That's who you are." "Adam, listen to me. It's not what it looks like," she began, the pathetic, reflexive denial tumbling from her lips. "No." He cut her off, his voice gaining a hard edge. "It's exactly what it looks like. The way you looked at that kid, that's how you've looked at me my whole life. Like I'm an inconvenience, a problem you have to deal with. All those times I tried to explain my panic attacks and you just rolled your eyes and told me to get over it. That laugh, Mum. That was the sound of every one of those eye rolls. Every word was a perfectly aimed dart piercing through the layers of self-deception she had built up over the years. She had always seen herself as a no-nonsense efficient professional, a strong woman, making her way in a tough world. She never saw herself as cruel. But her son, the person who should have been the recipient of her unconditional love, was now holding up a mirror, and the reflection was monstrous. I didn't know," she stammered. Tears finally beginning to stream down her face, hot and shameful. "I'm so sorry, Adam." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Yeah," he finally said, the single word heavy with years of pain. "I know. Goodbye, Mom." He hung up. The click of the disconnected call echoed in the silence of the car. Brenda dropped the phone and let out a sob, a raw, guttural sound of pure agony. Losing her job of 19 years was devastating. Becoming a pariah on the internet was humiliating. But this losing the last frayed thread of connection with her son, and in the process being forced to truly see herself for the first time, was the real punishment. This was the hard karma. It wasn't just about losing a job. It was about the utter and complete destruction of her self-image. She was the monster. She was the villain. And she had no one to blame but herself. In the days that followed, the story of Flight 3471 became a national conversation. The FAA's preliminary report was leaked to the press, and it was damning. It confirmed a hairline fracture in a primary hydraulic line on the 737, a flaw that would have almost certainly led to a catastrophic failure at cruising altitude. The report also cited systemic pressure to prioritize on-time departures over rigorous safety protocols within Atlantic Airlines' Denver hub. The airline's stock plummeted. The CEO was forced to issue a public televised apology and announce a top-to-bottom overhaul of their maintenance procedures nationwide. David Henderson was no longer an anonymous teenager. He was the boy who saved Flight 3471. News stories hailed his sharp hearing and encyclopedic knowledge of aviation. He was uncomfortable with the sudden fame, but Chloe helped him navigate it, ensuring the focus remained on the importance of listening to passengers and the larger issues of airline safety and disability awareness. The airline, desperate for some positive press, reached out to the Hendersons. They offered a formal apology from the new CEO, a lifetime supply of first-class tickets, and a significant undisclosed financial settlement. Chloe accepted the apology and negotiated the settlement not for them, but to be donated in its entirety to a prominent disability advocacy group and a charity that provided STEM scholarships for underprivileged youth. The most meaningful offer, however, came from a different source. An executive at a major aerospace and defense contractor, a man whose own family had been on that flight, saw the story. He was so moved by David's knowledge and composure that he reached out personally. He offered David a private all-access tour of their advanced aeronautical design facility, the kind of place where next-generation aircraft were born. And with it came the promise of a fully funded internship when he started college. For David, this was worth more than any amount of money. It was the validation of his passion, a door opening into the future he had always dreamed of. Rebecca Albright, the consultant who had filmed the video, also connected with the Hendersons. She flew to San Francisco a few weeks later to meet them for dinner. A genuine friendship blossomed, forged in the crucible of that day at the airport. Rebecca was deeply impressed by David's quiet strength and Chloe's unwavering advocacy. She decided to take on Pro Bono, a major disability rights organization, as a client, using her formidable skills in corporate strategy to help them more effectively challenge systemic discrimination. The ripple effect of that day continued to spread. For Brenda Jenkins, the aftermath was a quiet, brutal reckoning. The public shaming eventually faded as the internet's insatiable gaze moved on to the next outrage. But the internal shame remained. The conversation with her son had shattered her. She sold her house, downsized to a small apartment, and spent months in therapy trying to understand the bitterness that had taken root in her heart over the years. One day, her therapist suggested volunteering. It was a cliché, but it was also a path. She found a local community center that ran programs for adults with disabilities, many of whom struggled to find employment. At first, it was agonizing. Every person she helped was a reminder of her cruelty to David. But slowly, painstakingly, she began to change. She learned to listen. She stopped seeing people as problems and started seeing them as individuals, each with their own story, their own struggles, their own incredible resilience. She learned empathy not as a concept, but as a practice. She started writing letters to her son, Adam. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She just told him what she was doing, what she was learning about herself and about him. She acknowledged the pain she had caused without excuses. For a long time, he didn't reply. Then one day a simple 2-word text message appeared on her phone. "Keep going." It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a beginning. The story of Flight 3471 eventually faded from the headlines, becoming another anecdote in the turbulent history of air travel. But for those involved, its lessons were indelible. It was a story about how a single moment of cruelty could have catastrophic consequences, and how a single act of listening could avert them. It was a testament to the fact that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they're just a 17-year-old boy in a window seat who loves airplanes. And it was a stark reminder that karma, when it finally arrives, is not always about punishment. Sometimes, in its own harsh and unforgiving way, it is about the painful, necessary, and ultimately hopeful chance for redemption. The story of David Henderson and Brenda Jenkins is a powerful reminder that our actions, no matter how small, create ripples that can touch countless lives. In a world that often feels disconnected, it shows us that decency, empathy, and speaking up against injustice are not just virtues, they are forces of nature. David's quiet knowledge saved hundreds of lives, while Brenda's moment of cruelty cost her everything, only to set her on a long, painful road toward becoming a better person. If this story moved you, please hit that like button to help it reach more people. Share it with your friends and family to spread this important message about dignity and respect. And don't forget to subscribe and click the notification bell so you won't miss our next deep dive into real-life stories where karma delivers its most unforgettable lessons. Thank you for listening.